Inc., the business of Shaquille O'Neal. And so I just recently interviewed him, and I actually asked him about Caitlin Clark, and he had an interesting take on it, which he said the tension in the league right now is not racially motivated tension, it's not political tension, it's a rite of passage that she is going to be the face of the league, but the existing veteran players are not going to let her until she basically goes through this on the court hazing ritual. And
what happens when one hard foul stops being just a hard foul? That is the question now hanging over the WNBA after a chaotic night involving Sophie Cunningham and DJonai Carrington turned into something much bigger than anyone inside the arena probably expected. The play itself lasted only a few seconds. Carrington chased down Cunningham on a fast break, made contact high around the head and neck. Cunningham hit the floor, and the officials eventually upgraded the foul to a flagrant 2 and ejected Carrington. But almost immediately, the conversation escaped the basketball court.
Take a walk with me, take a walk with me, take a walk with me. There is craziness going on in the WNBA. DJonai Carrington tweeted out white privilege from the locker room of a game that she was playing in. Get this, she fouled Sophie Cunningham hard. Sophie Cunningham, obviously a white person, fouled her hard. Flagrant 2, gets ejected, goes to the locker room and tweets out white privilege in the middle of the game. Now here's the kicker to me. A flagrant 2 has to be contact that can lead to an injury that looks excessive. DJonai, it was about as excessive as possible. If there was any evidence of there being white privilege, this was not it. What the hell do y'all think?
Carrington posted the words white privilege while the game was still going on. Cunningham reacted strongly to the collision. Commentators began arguing over whether the foul was a legitimate basketball play or something more serious, and suddenly Caitlin Clark was pulled into a debate that had started with 2 other players. Then came another twist. Clark herself had received what appeared to be her 8th technical foul of the season during that same game, a call that would ordinarily have triggered a suspension. The WNBA later rescinded that technical, meaning Clark avoided the automatic 1-game suspension. And just when the entire situation seemed impossible to untangle, Shaquille O'Neal entered the conversation with a completely different argument. According to Shaq, the rough treatment Clark has received is part of a rite of passage that great athletes have always experienced.
He's gonna go walking in for a layup, and so I don't oppose the hard foul, but I also don't think that she intentionally went for the net.
Stephanie White, we shouldn't be surprised. This is somebody who has come out and admitted publicly that she's uneducated on the difference between male and female. She's uneducated on. So are we really surprised that this is Stephanie White's thought process here? I've been saying Stephanie needs to be fired for over a year. The reason she never defends Caitlin is because she agrees with the rough play. In fact, she taught DJonai and AT how to play this way. She was there.
That comment created another debate. Is Clark simply going through the normal growing pains of becoming a superstar? Or has the WNBA reached a point where physicality, officiating, race, social media, and superstar treatment have become so intertwined that every controversial play now carries consequences far beyond the scoreboard? To understand why this particular incident exploded, you have to start with the play itself, rather than the arguments that came afterward. During Indiana's 90-86 victory over Chicago, Cunningham was running toward the basket on a fast break when Carrington came from behind, attempting to make a defensive play. Carrington made significant contact with Cunningham around the head and neck area, sending Cunningham to the floor as she completed the shot. The officials reviewed the contact and upgraded the original ruling to a flagrant 2, which resulted in Carrington's ejection. The referee's explanation focused on the combination of the wind-up, the impact, and the follow-through. That detail matters because it tells us what the officials were actually evaluating. They were not publicly announcing that Carrington intended to injure Cunningham. They were judging the nature of the contact itself. Cunningham, however, had a much harsher interpretation. After getting back to her feet, she moved toward Carrington and had to be separated by teammates and security. Later, Cunningham said she believed the foul was unnecessary and described it as intentional. Carrington later offered the opposite explanation, saying she was attempting to make a defensive play she had made many times throughout her career and that the contact was unfortunate rather than intentional. Chicago coach Tyler Marsh also said his initial live impression was that Carrington had been attempting to make a play on the ball and did not believe it warranted a flagrant 2. Indiana coach Stephanie White landed somewhere in the middle.
The crew felt that Caitlin put a little extra sauce on the forearm when she ran into that official. Did the league get this right, rescinding the technical foul?
Can we see it again? Team crew in the control room, can I see it again? Because you all watched this in real time.
Yeah.
You all watched this happen in real time. I was surprised that a technical foul was called.
It because for that action being minimal, like a brush, this is what should have happened and the right thing happened. What? Like, what is
all I'm saying is I have flashbacks to college when my teammate bumped into a coach like this and it was a problem.
Where your teammate did what?
Bumped into one of our coaches this way and it was a problem. But I think when we analyze it, if Caitlin didn't say anything, it is marginal. I think rescinding it was fine. But I do understand in the moment how we got here.
Well,
White characterized it as a hard foul and said she did not believe Carrington intentionally came out to hit Cunningham across the neck, but she also agreed that the ejection was the correct decision. And that disagreement is important because it prevents the story from being reduced to a simple good guy versus bad guy narrative. The same moment produced 3 different interpretations from people who were actually involved. Cunningham saw something unnecessary and intentional. Carrington described a defensive play gone wrong. White acknowledged that the contact looked serious while stopping short of accusing Carrington of deliberate harm. So before social media turned the incident into something much larger, there was already a genuine basketball question. How should the league punish a defensive play when the result is dangerous but the defender says the intention was simply to stop an open layup? Then came the post that completely changed the temperature. Shortly after being ejected, Carrington posted "white privilege" and tagged the Indiana Fever. Because Cunningham is white and Carrington is black, the post immediately became part of a racial discussion surrounding the incident. That interpretation spread rapidly online, with commentators treating the message as a direct accusation that Carrington had been ejected because she fouled a white player. But that is precisely where the facts become more complicated. Carrington later clarified that she was not claiming the flagrant 2 ruling itself was the result of white privilege. She said the foul was unfortunate and unintentional while declining to provide a detailed explanation for the social media post. That distinction matters enormously. The original post was real, the timing was real, the racial interpretation that followed was real as a public reaction. But the assumption that the post definitively meant the officials ejected me because Cunningham is white goes further than what Carrington later said. And this is one of the most important lessons from the entire controversy. Once a statement hits social media, people often fill in the missing context themselves. A few words can become a headline. The headline can become a narrative, and eventually the narrative can become something completely different from what the person originally intended. In this case, that process happened almost instantly. The basketball question was whether the flagrant 2 was justified. Within minutes, people were debating race, privilege, favoritism, the treatment of Clark, and the supposed culture of the entire league. Suddenly, Carrington and Cunningham were no longer simply 2 players involved in a heated game. They had become symbols in a much larger argument that had already been building for years. That larger argument exists because Caitlin Clark has changed the amount of attention surrounding the WNBA.
I told you Sophie Cunningham was going to be the next target. I've been telling you guys for weeks. Sophie would take the role of Caitlin Clark as public enemy number 1 in the WNBA dump. And yesterday was the first attack. You know, I wasn't able to predict this because I'm some brilliant scholar or philosopher. This prediction was not delivered to me in a dream or a vision that came from the dearly departed Miss Clea.
Whether people love her, dislike her, defend her, criticize her, or simply watch because of her, Clark has become one of the most visible athletes in the sport. Every foul against her receives enormous attention. Every argument involving her becomes content. Every interaction with an opponent gets replayed, clipped, analyzed, and debated. That does not automatically mean Clark is being treated unfairly. It does mean that the spotlight around her is unlike anything most WNBA players have experienced. And once that spotlight became connected to the Cunningham-Carrington incident, older arguments immediately returned. Fans began bringing up previous hard fouls against Clark. Commentators began asking whether the league protects its biggest star enough. Others pushed back and argued that Clark should not receive special treatment simply because she is the league's most recognizable player. Both sides have a point worth considering. Professional basketball cannot become a sport where stars receive a completely different set of rules. At the same time, leagues have an obvious responsibility to protect players from dangerous contact, regardless of who the player is. The difficult question is not whether Clark should receive special rules, it is whether the existing rules are being applied consistently to everyone. That distinction is what gets lost when the debate becomes personal, and that is exactly why Shaquille O'Neal's comments became so interesting. Shaq's argument was almost the opposite of the outrage surrounding Clark's physical treatment. The NBA legend said that great athletes often have to go through what he described as a rite of passage. His point was that when a young superstar arrives and threatens to become the face of a league, established players are not simply going to hand over that status. They make the newcomer earn it. O'Neal compared Clark's situation to the treatment experienced by stars such as Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Magic Johnson, and Muhammad Ali, arguing that elite competitors have historically faced resistance when entering a new level of competition. Coming from Shaq, that argument carries a certain weight, because he knows exactly what it feels like to become the player everyone wants to stop. During his NBA career, physical defenders routinely tried to slow him down with aggressive contact. So when Shaq looks at Clark and says, essentially, "Welcome to the top," he is speaking from a particular basketball philosophy.
They didn't make this play successfully, right? Trying to get a block over the top. It was a very hard foul. DJonai has made this play successfully so many times throughout her career. No matter what team she has played on, we have seen DJonai make transition blocks.
Right.
So to me, I understand it was called a flagrant 2. I wouldn't have been mad if it was called a flagrant 1 because I do think she was making a basketball play. It was just a hard.
But there is an important difference between physical competition and dangerous contact. A hard foul can be part of basketball. A defender can contest a fast break aggressively. A superstar can be challenged without being protected from legitimate competition. But the moment contact becomes reckless, the league has to draw a line. That is why the Carrington incident cannot simply be dismissed with, "This is professional basketball." The entire purpose of the flagrant foul system is to establish that some forms of physicality go beyond ordinary competition. Shaq's argument explains why Clark may face greater resistance as she rises. It does not eliminate the responsibility of officials to determine where acceptable physicality ends. And this is where the officiating debate becomes impossible to ignore. The most damaging thing for a professional sports league is not necessarily one controversial call. It is uncertainty about the standard. Players can accept difficult rules if they know what those rules are. Coaches can adjust if they understand how officials are interpreting contact. Fans can disagree with a call while still trusting the system if they believe the same standard will be applied the next night. But when two similar plays appear to receive dramatically different punishments, people begin creating their own explanations. That is when accusations of favoritism start. That is when players become frustrated. That is when every replay becomes evidence for someone's argument. The Carrington-Cunningham incident arrived at exactly the wrong time for the WNBA because another officiating controversy was unfolding during the same game. Caitlin Clark received what was initially ruled her 8th technical foul after making contact with an official. Under the league's rules, an 8th technical triggers an automatic one-game suspension. The call, therefore, had enormous consequences, but the WNBA rescinded the technical after the game, and Clark avoided the suspension that would otherwise have kept her out against the New York Liberty. That decision immediately created another question. If the league can review a technical after the game and decide it should never have been assessed, what does that say about the original call? To be clear, rescinding a bad call is not necessarily evidence of favoritism. In fact, correcting an incorrect decision can be exactly what a fair league should do. But because Clark is involved, the correction becomes part of a much larger public conversation. Supporters see it as proof that the league recognized an unfair call. Critics can interpret it as evidence that the biggest star receives unusual attention. The truth is more mundane, but also more important. Officials can make mistakes, leagues can correct them, and consistency depends on how often those mistakes occur and how transparently they are handled.
Watching the game, Sophie Cunningham going on a fast break, and again, DJonai Carrington, you're not going for the ball. You literally went straight for her cranium. So I don't know why you see her screaming white privilege after that. Don't deflect from the malicious, the blatant, and overly aggressive foul that you just created. That again, if the WNBA does not suspend you for multiple games, they're going to protest.
The timing made everything even more explosive. Carrington was ejected during the first half. Cunningham had to be restrained after getting back to her feet. Carrington's post appeared while the game was still happening. Clark's technical foul controversy was unfolding in the same contest. Then the game ended with Indiana winning by 4 points. That meant the controversy had multiple separate storylines operating simultaneously. One involved player safety, one involved racial interpretation, one involved officiating, one involved Clark's suspension, and another involved the growing political and cultural arguments that have surrounded the WNBA. When all of those topics collide, the original basketball play almost becomes secondary. People stop asking, was this flagrant too, and start asking, what does this say about the league? That is a much harder question to answer, because the answer depends on what someone already believes. If someone already believes the WNBA is unfair to Clark, this incident looks like another piece of evidence. If someone believes Clark receives disproportionate protection and attention, the same incident looks completely different. If someone sees the league primarily through the lens of racial politics, the Carrington post becomes the central detail. If someone watches purely for basketball, the question may be much simpler. A defender made hard contact with a player in the head and neck area, officials reviewed it, and an ejection followed. All four perspectives can exist at the same time. The problem begins when one perspective is presented as the only possible explanation. That is also why the word intent became so important. Basketball officials rarely have the luxury of knowing exactly what was inside a player's head. They can observe the play, they can examine the replay, they can judge the force, direction, wind up, follow through, and location of the contact. But determining whether a player secretly wanted to hurt someone is much more difficult. Cunningham believed the contact was intentional. Carrington said it was not. White did not believe Carrington intentionally targeted Cunningham's neck, but still agreed with the flagrant 2. Those statements can all exist without one person necessarily lying. A player can feel that a foul was intentional because of how it looked and how it felt. A defender can genuinely believe she was attempting to make a basketball play. A coach can believe the contact was accidental while still believing the punishment was justified. This is why the strongest version of the story does not require accusing anyone of secretly plotting anything. The incident was already controversial enough. The real question is whether the league's punishment matched the level of contact and whether players understand what will happen the next time a similar play occurs. Then there is Sophie Cunningham herself, whose role in this story has become much larger than the statistics of one game. Cunningham has increasingly become one of the most recognizable personalities around the Indiana Fever, and that visibility has made her a target of both support and criticism. Her outspoken personality means that incidents involving her rarely stay quiet. That is not necessarily a negative. Sports need personalities. Rivalries need emotion.
The reason I saw this coming is because I have been seeing this same thing in this toxic turd of a league for years. As I am watching the reactions on social media yesterday of DJonai Carrington assaulting Sophie Cunningham, and that's what this was, assault. This was not incidental contact in the rhythm of a basketball game, mainly because the WNBA is not a basketball league. What you saw yesterday, that was intentional assault. And like I said,
fans connect with athletes who appear to have genuine character rather than perfectly polished public relations statements. But the downside is that when a player becomes part of a larger cultural conversation, Every incident involving that player gets interpreted through the existing narrative. Cunningham's supporters saw the Carrington collision as another example of aggressive treatment toward a Fever player. Her critics saw the response as part of the league's growing political divide. Cunningham herself, however, said something that cut through some of the online speculation. She supported the league's disciplinary decision and said race was not a factor in the foul. Reuters reported that she viewed the foul as unnecessary while also backing the league's punishment. That is significant because it complicates the narrative being built around her. The online debate may have become about race, but the player who actually took the hit did not frame the incident entirely in those terms. Once again, the difference between what happened and what people said happened becomes the story. And that difference has become one of the WNBA's biggest challenges. The league is growing at a remarkable pace, and with that growth comes an audience far larger than the audience that followed the league several years ago. More people means more attention, but it also means more disagreement. A controversial play that once might have generated a few conversations among dedicated basketball fans can now become a national argument within minutes. Clips travel faster than context. Headlines travel faster than explanations. Social media posts can reach millions before coaches or players have even spoken to reporters. That environment changes the incentives around every controversy. Fans want immediate answers. Commentators want immediate reactions. Players sometimes respond emotionally, and once a statement has been posted, deleting it does not necessarily make it disappear. The Carrington incident demonstrated that perfectly. The original foul was a basketball event. The white privilege post transformed it into a social argument. Carrington's later clarification added another layer. Suddenly, the controversy wasn't only about the foul anymore, it was about what people believed she meant when she posted those words. That is a completely different kind of debate, and it is almost impossible for a sports league to control once it starts moving online. There is another reason this matters. Caitlin Clark's presence has turned ordinary WNBA moments into major national stories. That is both a gift and a burden. Her popularity brings attention, money, viewers, and new fans. But it also means the league's weaknesses are now exposed to an audience that is much less willing to accept ambiguity. Every missed call gets replayed. Every hard foul gets analyzed from multiple angles. Every interaction between Clark and an opponent can become a viral clip. That scrutiny can be uncomfortable, but it can also force improvement. If officials are inconsistent, more attention makes that harder to hide. If a rule is unclear, fans will expose the confusion. If a disciplinary decision seems contradictory, people will compare it with every previous decision they can find. In that sense, the Clark effect is not necessarily destroying the league's culture. It may be accelerating a process that was going to happen anyway. The WNBA is becoming too visible for unclear standards to remain invisible. The question is whether the league will respond by becoming more transparent, or whether every new controversy will simply produce another cycle of outrage.
The Indiana Fever games, I don't know if I love them or I hate them at times. It's like if you like anything about reality TV, then the WNBA is, and sports, then the WNBA is for you. Sometimes it gets to be way too much, and this season, I gotta say, I've gotten to that place multiple times. But this game, love it or hate it, you can't say that you could have taken your eyes off of it for any second. The Indiana Fever came in against the Chicago Sky, playing on their home turf. And listen, the Chicago Sky have been a very bad team, but have also taken teams to the wire, like the Minnesota Lynx, nearly beating them very recently.
That brings us back to the idea of a rite of passage. Shaq's argument makes sense if you look at professional sports history. Every generation of superstar faces players who want to test them. Jordan was challenged. Kobe was challenged. LeBron was challenged. Shaq himself was challenged. Great players do not get automatic respect from everyone they compete against. They earn it. But there is another side to the argument that cannot be ignored. The existence of a rite of passage does not mean every form of physicality should be accepted. The NBA learned that lesson over decades as the sport developed clearer standards for flagrant fouls and player safety. The WNBA is going through its own evolution. It has to preserve the toughness that makes competition compelling without allowing dangerous contact to become normalized. That balance is especially important because Clark is not going to become less visible. If anything, her profile is likely to continue growing. The same is true for the players who oppose her on the court. The more important they become, the more attention every confrontation will receive. There is also a danger in assuming that every physical incident involving Clark or Cunningham must have the same explanation. Sometimes a defender makes a mistake. Sometimes a player is frustrated. Sometimes a referee misses something. Sometimes a call is corrected later. And sometimes fans see patterns because they are watching through the lens of previous controversies. That does not mean those fans are foolish. It means human beings naturally search for patterns. Once someone believes a league treats one player differently, every future decision is evaluated against that belief. A normal foul becomes evidence, a technical becomes evidence, a rescinded technical becomes evidence, an ejection becomes evidence, even the absence of a call becomes evidence. The only way to break that cycle is consistency. Not perfection, consistency. Officials will make mistakes, players will make mistakes, coaches will make mistakes, but if the league can explain the standard and demonstrate that it applies regardless of the player involved, the temperature eventually comes down. The Clark technical controversy provides an interesting example of how that process could work. Initially, Clark was assessed a technical after making contact with an official while her momentum carried her out of bounds. The official determined at the time that the contact was intentional. Clark and the Fever disputed that interpretation, and after reviewing the incident, the league rescinded the technical. The important part is not simply that Clark avoided a suspension, it is that the final decision recognized that the original interpretation was not sustainable. That is what a review system is supposed to do. But the league also has to understand why fans react so strongly to these reversals. When a call can determine whether the biggest star in the league is allowed to play in a nationally watched game, the explanation matters. People need to understand why the call was made and why it was later overturned. Without that transparency, even a legitimate correction can become another conspiracy theory. The same principle applies to Carrington's ejection. The league does not have to convince everyone that the flagrant 2 was the only possible decision. Basketball is subjective. Reasonable people can watch the same play and disagree.
Speaking of the WNBA, the video of Shaq going around talking about the WNBA, he goes,
I have a way to make it equal.
The WNBA, they have all the pieces to have a really good league. They have shooters, they have ball handlers, they have finesse. There's no
We just lower the rim so y'all can like
we put butts in the seat.
No.
I don't think that's the problem.
That's what Shaq said.
He's thinking basketball. He's not thinking why people want to watch shit.
Yeah.
You're a jiu-jitsu guy, right?
Yeah.
The good thing is women's jiu-jitsu, it's actually popping, but like let's say it wasn't. From a jiu-jitsu lens, you'd probably be like, oh yeah, if there's fucking more arm breaks, people are gonna watch it more.
What matters is whether the decision fits the written standard and whether that standard is applied elsewhere. Carrington's later explanation that the foul was not intentional does not automatically invalidate the official's decision. A player does not have to intend a dangerous result for a foul to be penalized severely. Conversely, a severe punishment does not automatically prove malicious intent. Those are two separate questions. The officials judged the contact, Carrington explained her intention, Cunningham explained how the play felt from the receiving end, the league made its ruling. That should be the framework for the conversation. Instead, social media often collapses those distinctions. Flagrant 2 becomes, she tried to hurt her. White privilege becomes, the player accused the league of racism. Rescinded technical becomes, the league protects Clark. Hard fouls become, the entire league hates Clark. None of those shortcuts necessarily captures the full situation. They are emotionally powerful because they turn complicated events into simple stories. And simple stories spread faster. But if the goal is to understand what is actually happening in the WNBA, the complicated version is more revealing. The league is dealing with an influx of attention. Its biggest star attracts intense competition. Its players have strong personalities and strong opinions. Its audience is divided politically and culturally. Social media magnifies every conflict. Officials operate under enormous scrutiny. And all of this is happening while the league is trying to establish itself as one of the major professional sports products in America. That last part may be the most important piece. The WNBA's growth means the old way of handling controversy is no longer enough. A league can no longer assume that a controversial game will disappear after 24 hours. The audience now expects explanations. Fans compare calls across games. Analysts dissect replay angles. Former NBA players weigh in. Politicians comment. Influencers build entire videos around a single play. The league's decisions can become part of the national conversation before the next game even starts. That creates pressure, but it also creates an opportunity. If the WNBA becomes more transparent about officiating standards, player discipline, and reviews, it could turn these controversies into evidence that the league is maturing. If it does not, each new incident will reinforce the belief that the rules are being applied inconsistently. And that is why the Cunningham-Carrington collision matters beyond one night in Chicago. The foul itself will eventually become another clip in the endless stream of sports footage. Players will move on. Teams will play more games, the standings will change, the playoffs will arrive, but the questions created by this incident will remain. How much physicality is too much? How should officials distinguish between a legitimate defensive play and reckless contact? How much should a player's intent matter? What happens when a player uses social media in the middle of an emotional game? How should the league respond when a controversial decision becomes part of a racial or political debate? And most importantly, can the WNBA protect its players without turning its biggest stars into exceptions to the rules? Caitlin Clark sits at the center of many of those questions, even when she is not directly involved. That is the strange position she occupies now. She is simultaneously a player, a superstar, a business driver, a cultural symbol, and a lightning rod. Some fans believe she receives unfair treatment. Others believe she receives excessive protection and media attention. Some believe the physicality directed at her is simply what happens to every rising superstar. Shaq clearly falls into that camp, arguing that Clark has to go through the same kind of resistance other great athletes faced before earning unquestioned respect.
I mean, I can't even say again because Caitlin finally pulled some rank around here, right? Caitlin, I wouldn't even say Caitlin Clark really pulled rank. I feel like her influence and her power alone dictated this action without her even having to lift a finger. I mean, getting suspended for literally being pushed into a referee might be the worst technical foul I've ever seen, and it's up there with Tim Duncan's technical foul. It's up there with it. But anyways, Caitlin Clark's technical foul, her 8th technical foul, which would have suspended her, which would have disqualified her from playing against the New York Liberty in Indiana on ESPN. Her 8th technical foul has been...
But Clark's supporters would argue that rite of passage should never become an excuse for dangerous play. Those positions are not necessarily incompatible. A superstar can be challenged without being endangered. Competition can be intense without becoming reckless. And a player can earn respect without having to endure unnecessary punishment. Interestingly, the latest developments suggest that Clark herself may be less interested in turning every controversy into a personal battle than the internet is. After the league rescinded her 8th technical, the immediate suspension threat disappeared. And when she later faced Carrington again, the rivalry itself became part of the spectacle. In a recent Fever Sky matchup, Clark erupted for 37 points, 8 three-pointers, and 10 assists in a 113-90 Indiana victory, while tensions with Carrington again produced attention around their interactions. That is another important shift. The best response to controversy on a basketball court is sometimes basketball. Instead of allowing every confrontation to become a referendum on identity, players can answer through performance. That does not solve the underlying issues, but it changes the conversation. When Clark responds to physical pressure by taking over a game, the story becomes about competition again. Yet the cultural side of the WNBA is not disappearing. In fact, recent coverage shows how deeply the league has become entangled with broader social and political arguments. The attention surrounding Clark and Cunningham has intersected with debates over race, gender, sexuality, player activism, and the direction of women's sports. That means future controversies are likely to carry similar baggage. A foul may be interpreted through an existing political narrative before anyone even checks the replay. A player's social media post can be interpreted as a statement about an entire demographic. A disciplinary decision can be framed as evidence of institutional bias. Once that happens, the WNBA has very little control over the conversation. The only thing it can control is the quality and consistency of its decisions. There is also a lesson here for the players. Social media gives athletes a direct line to millions of people, but that power comes with a price. A post made seconds after an ejection can become the defining image of an entire week. A frustrated comment can overshadow an otherwise excellent performance. Even if a player later clarifies what she meant, the first version may continue circulating forever. Carrington's white privilege post demonstrated exactly how quickly that can happen. Her later explanation that she was not claiming the flagrant 2 itself was caused by white privilege added context, but by then the original interpretation had already spread. That does not mean athletes should stay silent. It means they should understand the environment they are operating in. In today's sports world, the social media timeline is effectively part of the game. For fans, there is an equally important lesson. Not every controversial play requires choosing a side immediately.
Either way, DJonai Carrington came in and did not make the game boring at all. She hard fouled Sophie Cunningham in transition. Absolutely a flagrant 2. Just look at the way that Sophie Cunningham goes down. Dangerous, reckless, not okay. And what makes matters worse is DJonai Carrington goes to Threads and she posts white privilege, tagging the Indiana Fever. Now, I gotta say, this is something I just can't get down with anymore. Like the whole divisiveness of an issue that has nothing to do with white privilege.
You can believe Cunningham deserved protection without believing Carrington intended to injure her. You can believe Carrington's foul was too severe without agreeing with every interpretation of her social media post. You can support Clark without believing every foul against her is part of a conspiracy. You can criticize the WNBA without believing the entire league is broken. And you can acknowledge racial tension exists in the public conversation without automatically assuming that every basketball decision is motivated by race. Those distinctions may not produce the most explosive headline, but they produce a much more accurate understanding of what is happening. The irony is that the WNBA's biggest problem may actually be a consequence of its success. More people are watching, more people care, more people are arguing, more people are analyzing. The league has reached a level where a single foul can become a national story. That is not what happens to sports nobody cares about. It happens when a league has become culturally relevant. The challenge is learning how to handle that attention without allowing controversy to overwhelm the sport itself. Basketball has to remain the center of the story. Rivalries should create excitement. Physical defense should create intensity. Stars should create anticipation. But none of those things work if fans stop trusting the rules. And that brings us back to the question Shaq raised. Maybe Clark really is going through a rite of passage. Maybe every great player eventually reaches a point where everyone on the floor wants to knock them down, not literally, but metaphorically, and prove that they belong. Maybe the resistance she is experiencing is partly a compliment. It means opponents recognize how dangerous she is. It means they know she can change a game. It means she has become important enough that teams have to plan around her. But the rite of passage should have a boundary. The goal should be to test a superstar, not to make dangerous contact acceptable simply because she is a superstar. The league's responsibility is to define that boundary clearly. The Carrington-Cunningham incident showed how quickly that boundary can become blurred. A hard foul became an ejection. The ejection became a social media post. The post became a race debate. The race debate became part of the Caitlin Clark conversation. Clark's own technical foul controversy became another example of perceived inconsistency. Then Shaq's rite of passage argument added another philosophical layer. By the end, the original play was almost buried beneath everything people wanted it to represent. But underneath all the noise, the core issue is surprisingly simple. Professional basketball needs rules that players understand and officials can enforce consistently. If the league can accomplish that, the controversy surrounding Clark, Cunningham, Carrington, and everyone else becomes easier to manage. If it cannot, every new collision will reopen the same arguments. Fans will compare one foul to another. players will question the standard. Coaches will defend their teams. Former players will weigh in. Social media will search for motives. And Caitlin Clark, whether she wants the role or not, will remain somewhere near the center of the storm. That is the reality of becoming the face of a rapidly growing league. The attention is part of the opportunity, but it is also part of the burden. So perhaps the biggest question is not whether DJonai Carrington's foul was intentional. The evidence does not establish that she deliberately set out to injure Sophie Cunningham, and Carrington herself has denied that interpretation. The bigger question is whether the WNBA can create enough consistency that fans do not feel forced to invent explanations whenever something controversial happens. Perhaps the league does not need to eliminate physicality. Perhaps it needs to make the limits of physicality unmistakable. Perhaps it does not need to protect Clark from every hard foul. Perhaps it needs to make sure Clark, Cunningham, Carrington, and every other player are judged by the same standard. Because if that happens, the WNBA gets something much more valuable than a temporary reduction in controversy. It gets trust. And trust is what allows a league to survive when the spotlight becomes this intense. The Carrington-Cunningham collision may eventually be remembered as one heated moment in a long season. The white privilege post may eventually disappear beneath thousands of newer posts. Clark's rescinded technical will become another footnote in her career. Shaq's comments will eventually be replaced by another debate, but the underlying transformation of the WNBA is not going away. The league is entering a stage where every decision is magnified, every superstar is scrutinized, and every controversy can become a cultural event. The players are not just competing for wins anymore. They are competing under a microscope, and maybe that is the real rite of passage. Not just for Caitlin Clark, but for the entire NBA. The league now has the attention it spent decades trying to build. The question is whether it can handle everything that comes with it.